Hello everyone. Tonight we start a journey that is unlike any other, not through life, but via the most historically significant exits, the deaths that leave you in a state of shock, shaking your head and wondering if it was true. The most dramatic deaths in history are frequently as lyrical as they are tragic, from ancient warriors who preferred flames to surrender to inventors killed by their own creations. Let's start with Mithridates VI, who was a ruler, a warrior, and a linguist, and a man who was so paranoid that he practically made himself into a test subject. The Mithridates who ruled the kingdom of Pontus in the 1st century BCE were constantly afraid of being assassinated. This, to be honest, was a worry that ancient kings had very legitimately. Poison was the quick, simple, and popular medieval espresso shot at royal dinner parties. What then did he do? He began to take little doses of everything that might kill him. Just a taste of belladonna, hemlock, a dash of arsenic, and a pinch. He gradually developed what was thought to be almost complete immunity. His personal chemists even produced a fabled remedy known as the Mithridatium, a remedy so powerful that more than a millennium later, medieval physicians were still attempting to duplicate it. In addition to eating, this man dared to attempt anything. Then Rome arrived. His science endeavor was of little interest to them. After a string of violent skirmishes, Mithridates found himself in a tight spot because Rome wanted Pontus. After being betrayed, encircled, and in danger of being captured, the arrogant monarch made the decision that he would not allow his adversaries to enjoy the pleasure of putting him on a chain parade through the streets of Rome. He grabbed for his old, devoted companion and the poison, but nothing was there. He was actually immune to dying after years of meticulously vaccinating himself against it, at least the tasteful, low-key sort. Mithridates had outplayed his own escape plan, much like a cook who was impervious to fire or a fish that had forgotten how to drown. He basically responded, "All right, plan B, do it manually," to one of his mercenaries as Romans broke down the gates. The king who outwitted poisons was suddenly defeated by a traditional sword thrust. Sometimes consistency is more important than cleverness when it comes to dying. History remembers Mithridates as the man who could be stabbed like everyone else but could not be chemically slain. Really, it's almost poetry, a warning that no matter how carefully you prepare, a rusty blade is always close by in case something goes wrong. Like all good Viking stories, our next one starts with a Viking and involves dental retaliation, swagger, and beheading. Meet the Norse earl who ruled the Orkney Islands in the 9th century, Sigurd Eysteinsson, also called Sigurd the Mighty. Apparently not one for subtlety, Sigurd was fierce in combat, proud of his victories, and had a slight rivalry with a Scottish nobleman named Bricta, the buck-toothed. Yes, that is a real moniker. And yes, it will become unsettlingly relevant. Bricta was tired of the back and forth, so Sigurd challenged him to a fight with 40 men each. However, in typical Viking form, Sigurd cheated. He brought 80. Bricta did not have the advantage in the math. The outcome? Complete slaughter. In a daring maneuver that can only be characterized as excessive, Sigurd fastened the severed head to his saddle as a memento on his triumphant journey home after decapitating Bricta in the midst of the mayhem. This is where things start to go wrong. Bricta's head swung against the horse as Sigurd roared over the countryside, feeling like a battle god. As fate would have it, one of Bricta's renownedly huge teeth grazed Sigurd's leg. It's only a scratch, so there's no need to panic. False. The 9th century was in question. Not a single bandage, antibiotic, or neosporin was present. The wound developed an infection. After becoming unwell, Sigurd passed away in a matter of days. Yes, the tooth of a man he had already decapitated killed him. Although Bright lost the war, he unquestionably prevailed in the grudge match. It's the type of tale that seems to fit into a myth. A warrior is chastised for his conceit, killed by the tiniest, most sardonic detail, a historical relic. Furthermore, few Viking sagas are as lyrically ridiculous as this one, despite the fact that they frequently feature dramatic deaths, fiery ships, and curses from enraged gods. Thinking he had triumphed, Sigurd rode home. Rather, he became the subject of one of the most odd obituaries in history. Let that serve as a lesson. Check your saddle even when you've won. Don't strap enemy heads to your horse, perhaps. You never know what plans Teeth might have. To illustrate the concept, let's consider Pyrrhus of Epirus, a man who was so skilled at winning battles that he lost entire wars. This was no little honor. Pyrrhus was an enduring thorn in Rome's side and the cousin of Alexander the Great, a military genius. Pyrrhic wins, in which you win in theory but lose so badly that you might as well have stayed home and done the laundry, were his specialty. Pyrrhus ended up in Argos, attempting to resolve yet another Greek political crisis after years of hard wars, valiant charges, and yelling at elephants to obey orders. Even though it was late and he was exhausted, honor and poor choices required one more fight. Thus Pyrrhus led his army into the city in the dead of night. However, this was not a spectacular movie entrance. In the tiny alleyways, his elephants became stuck. His troops became disoriented. By daybreak, the famous General Pyrrhus was fighting random foes with his sword in an alley like a drunken tourist wearing armor. This is where fate sharpens its pencil of comedy. From her rooftop above the street, an old woman observed the mayhem. Her name is unknown to us, but we do know this. She had views, a roof tile too, and she made the decision to join in. The casual accuracy of someone who had obviously thrown a few things before, most likely at grandchildren, chickens, or other kings who were invading. She let the tile fall. Direct impact. Pyrrhus was clonked on the head by the ceramic shingle. Like a bag of stale turnips, he collapsed to the ground. Either opportunistic or bewildered, one of the enemy soldiers hurried over and killed him. Suddenly, a Greek grandmother and simple building materials took out the man who had withstood Macedonian politics, Roman legions, and his own ego. Not a great final duel. No magnificent charge, just a deadly experience with poor roof upkeep. The woman is not represented by a statue. For finest usage of architectural debris in urban fighting, there is no recognized award, but really, there ought to be. Pyrrhus, too. He turned into a warning story. A reminder that gravity always prevails, regardless of the size of your army. Next up is the Russian mystic, healer, and beard aficionado Grigory Rasputin, whose passing has come to represent overkill. Rasputin was now a cosmic issue as addition to a political one. He had entranced the host's wife and all of her friends, and he was like that one person at a party who would not go away or stop talking about his spiritual visions. In this instance, the party was a collapsing monarchy, and the host was Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. The Russian aristocracy, of course, wanted him out. First, politely. Rasputin, however, was not subtle. They then proceeded to commit murder. Poison is plan A. They prepared a cake for him and filled it with enough cyanide to destroy an entire village. After eating it, Rasputin grinned and requested more. Someone most likely began perspiring at this point. They decided to shoot him as a backup plan. They did, in fact. Within the chest, Rasputin fell. Achievement. Leaning in, they verified. A poor decision. Like a villain in a horror film, he sat up and began to roar. At this point, there was undoubtedly a scream and a glass drop. Plan C is to shoot him once more. Several times, he fell once more, but it's not quite finished yet. Then, purportedly attempting to escape the palace, Rasputin crawled across the floor. For what reason? Bullets hadn't stopped him before, really. The assassins had ran out of ideas by this point. They dumped him into the freezing Neva after tying him up and dragging him to the river. You are aware. To be comprehensive, this is the last twist. It was said that his hands were clawing at the ice when his body was discovered downstream, which suggests that he was still alive and attempting to flee while submerged. Since he was, of course, Rasputin was ultimately killed by poisoning, shooting, blunt force trauma, and drowning. No one would have even batted an eyelid if they had attempted to drive a spike through his heart or stab him with garlic. What can we learn from this then? Never undervalue a man with allegedly iron skin, poor hygiene, and dubious theology. Chrysippus of Soli, a Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece, is responsible for our next departure. He devoted his life to thinking about ethics, logic, and presumably fig-eating animals. Now the seriousness of Stoic philosophers was well known. They taught rational thinking, emotional control, and maintaining a straight face in the face of adversity. Chrysippus, though, he laughed and left. Literally. Chrysippus was pacing dramatically in a toga one afternoon, doing whatever it was that ancient philosophers did in between lectures when he observed something strange. A fig-eating donkey, that's all. The scene is that. To wash down the figs, Chrysippus, obviously in a mood, turned to a servant and ordered, "Give that donkey a drink of wine." That's when it occurred. He burst out laughing, and he continued, not a courteous laugh, not the sneer of a philosopher, a full-blown, heart-pounding, gasping, wheezing, crying, laughing, and dying fit. Indeed, the man who could talk about the nature of the universe for hours passed away because he found a donkey drinking wine and munching fruit too amusing to bear. To be clear, strange deaths of ancient Greek philosophers were not new. While stargazing, one reportedly choked on a fig, and another fell into a well. Chrysippus, however, gave the bit his whole attention. Picture the scene. As the students assembled for yet another moral lesson, they saw their teacher lying on the ground, still grinning, possibly in the middle of a chuckle. Not precisely the legacy Plato envisioned. One punchline can demolish a Stoic whose entire life was about suppressing emotion in a way that is incredibly hilarious. It would be similar to a fire safety instructor juggling matches close to a curtain. What a legacy, too! Your metaphysical theories may be forgotten, but what about the man who died laughing at his own joke about a donkey? It will be inherited for millennia. The best medicine, so the saying goes, is laughing. It most certainly wasn't in this instance. Introducing Franz Reichelt, a visionary and ambitious man who asked himself, why should only birds have all the fun? In the early 1900s, Franz, a tailor from Austria, lived in Paris. He did more than stitch outfits, though. His goal was to stitch history. His concept? A parachute that can be worn. Yes, exactly. Creating a coat that could change into wings was Franz's ambition. Aviation meets fashion. By this time, early aviation was still in disarray, with planes that resembled flying kites and more crashes than landings. Franz reasoned that pilots could at least glide down in luxury if they had to leave. Franz was prepared after numerous trials, prototypes and attempts, the majority of which ended with crash dummies falling to the ground. He believed he was, anyway. He insisted on testing it himself, even though friends and authorities begged him not to. And the Eiffel Tower provides the ideal backdrop for this spectacular premiere. The year was 1912. Wearing his flying coat with pride, Franz came in full media style. Cameras rolled, reporters gathered, and even cops were present, mostly to try to stop him, but partly because they were kind of intrigued. He ascended the tower, stood on the ledge, and waved to the throng. Then he leaped. The parachute? It didn't even slightly open, like a tailor-shaped brick, Franz dropped straight to the ground, hitting it at around, we don't measure speed in pain, miles per hour. With a twisted coat, a crater, and an awkward stillness among onlookers, he died instantly. If it hadn't also been so flawlessly ironic, the ending would have been devastating. A man attempting to ensure the safety of fallen by tumbling. He left to pursue his passion of invention. Regretfully, his last prototype was also his last moment. Even though history can be unkind, it remembers him as the flying tailor, rather than as a tailor or even an inventor. A man who was aiming for the sky but ended up on the ground. Let me present you to Valerian, the only Roman emperor to be captured in combat and then converted into furniture, if you believed that being an emperor meant endless splendor, flowing togas, and grapes served on silver platters. The Roman Empire was crumbling like an overdone lasagna in the 3rd century CE, when Valerian ruled. Every year there were civil wars, plagues, and barbarian invasions. It was chaos on your own terms. Valerian nevertheless made an effort to remain composed. One of his biggest obstacles? Shapur III, a Persian ruler in particular, was not amenable to Roman posturing at all. In order to establish his power, Valerian assembled his army and marched east. It didn't work out. The Roman army was destroyed in the Battle of Edessa. Yet Valerian survived, a rare occurrence in those days. It was like trying to snare a unicorn in a bear trap to capture an emperor. You would imagine that Shapur would either use diplomatic power or demand a ransom. Not at all. Shapur thought of something better. He literally used Valerian as a footrest. Yes, exactly. The former emperor was always brought out to kneel beneath Shapur's boots whenever he mounted his horse. Every day, in public, it's humiliation with choreography, not simply humiliation. And it got worse just when you thought it couldn't get much worse. Valerian passed away in captivity following years of this royal devaluation. How? Although there are conflicting accounts, the most colourful one claims that Shapur had him skinned, packed with straw, and put on display in a Persian temple as a battle prize. Rome was warned, a Persian victory. The worst day of a taxidermist's career, let's face it. Naturally, Rome was not happy. Valerian's fate was never formally acknowledged by them. They pretended that he simply sort of vanished. Most likely enjoying a glass of wine in retirement? Yes. However, Valerian's fate remains ingrained in history. Hubris, poor planning, and a king with a very literal sense of humor brought down a powerful ruler. Introducing King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, a king who is more renowned for losing a duel with his own meal than for managing a country. The 18th century, while Adolf Frederick ruled, was a rather tranquil period in Swedish history. He wasn't well known for his intellectual writings, broad reforms, or conflicts. No, he is well known for literally and not figuratively eating himself to death. This was not a circumstance where poetry was consumed by ambition. This was a death by buffet, literally. The final day before Lent was Fat Tuesday in 1771, an ideal justification for indulging. King Adolf also didn't mince words. He reportedly drank 14 portions of his favorite dessert, semla, smoked herring champagne, and lobster caviar sauerkraut. If you have never tried a semla, picture a bun stuffed with almond paste and whipped cream and floating in warm milk with a hint of cardamom. Delectable, fluffy, guilelessly innocent. Unless you consume them 14 times in a row, in which case they turn into a pastry version of the Viking curse. The monarch apparently complained of stomachaches after this valiant endeavour, which is, let's face it, the most nicest way for history to describe what must have been a full-bodied insurrection. He died shortly after. What caused the death? They claimed to have digestive issues. We could classify that as fatal food regret in modern parlance. Naturally, the people of Sweden were surprised. You have a monarch 1 minute and then a dessert has outwitted him. Not a murderer, not a revolt, no duel. Almonds and cream. It has a rather poetic quality to it. A king savouring the very opulence that characterized his existence for the final time. The royal court made an effort to maintain its dignity. However, the menu is remembered by history. Sweden continues to celebrate Fat Tuesday with semla buns to this day. Indeed, the king who loved them a bit too much is mentioned by someone every year. The most well-known minimalist, social critic, and professional button pusher from ancient Greece is Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes lived in what was effectively a gigantic clay jar, wore the same tunic every day, and was a philosopher of the Cynic school, a polite way of stating that he didn't care what people thought. He supported a life devoid of material belongings, social pressures, and private humiliation. He also put his teachings into practice, in public, quite loudly, indecently at times. How, then, did this grizzled legend die? Ancient sources don't agree, which is always a warning sign when it comes to historical narrative. However, according to one of the most amusing stories, Diogenes died by holding his breath, indeed, voluntarily. I'm done with the world, so to speak. Just don't let me breathe again. Some claim it was a final mic drop in a life devoted to defying society, an act of willpower. Others believe he was simply being extremely obstinate and perhaps attempting to make a point about being in charge of his own fate. To be fair, his death has been attributed to various factors. According to one account, he perished after consuming raw octopus. Another says he was attacked by a dog, which seems a touch too poetic considering his penchant for dog metaphors. The breath-holding theory, however, that one is trapped, most likely because it's simply so Diogenes. This man once claimed to be looking for an honest man while carrying a lantern through the streets at high noon. Someone who told the world's most powerful man, Alexander the Great, to get out of the way because he was obstructing the sun. Therefore, it does fit the brand to decide to cease breathing because you're just done with people. What's the best part? It was respected. He was eventually honored with a public tomb by the same society that he ridiculed, questioned, and rejected. It turns out that you get remembered if you're a sour person with good one-liners. Diogenes passed away as he had lived, strangely dramatically and entirely according to his own terms. Let's go on to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a guy so rich that he made other Roman millionaires feel like petty potters. Crassus was more than just wealthy. He was outrageously wealthy. He possessed fire departments, slaves, vast estate, and silver mines. He did in fact own fire departments, which he dispatched to flaming structures and offered to assist if you sold him the land first. Roman edition of real estate shark. However, he want more. Not only gold, glory. He was already profitable. He now aspired to be recognized as a man who overcame more than a tax evasion, like Caesar or Pompey. Thus, in 53 BCE, Crassus made the decision to attack Rome's affluent eastern neighbor, Parthia. Consider it the Roman equivalent of, "Hold my wine, I got this." It was a catastrophe. He misjudged the Parthians, who had skilled cavalry, fearsome archers, and little desire to be subdued. Crassus led his army straight into a trap and into the middle of the desert. They massacred thousands of Roman soldiers. They killed his son. During budget cuts, morale fell apart more quickly than a Roman aqueduct. Crassus was eventually taken prisoner. The Parthians were aware of his identity now. The legends had been told to them. Rome's wealthiest man, a man who is fascinated with money, a walking coin purse, if you will. They therefore put him to death by pouring molten gold down his mouth as a farewell present. That's right, Rome's wealthiest guy choked to death on his liquid fortune. It was more of a performance piece than an execution. A harsh, theatrical message. Did you desire gold? take it here, until you reach your lungs. It's a myth, according to some. Some claim it's overblown, even though it wasn't precisely how he passed away. The tale quickly went viral in Rome. The problem with history is that it occasionally favors poetic justice above dull reality. The gilded death of Crassus became a warning. It's about hubris as much as greed, about carrying a bag of coins and flying too near the sun. If you have ever heard the slogan, "I am Spartacus," you should know that the man behind the meme and movie scene actually battled until no one, including himself, was left standing. Spartacus was not a hero by birth. He was a soldier from Thrace who was taken prisoner by the Romans and sent to the harsh, merciless world of gladiator schools, which were more like Hogwarts for warriors and more like daily beatings with the rare piece of bread. He practiced. He lived. Then he resisted. Using kitchen knives and anything else that wasn't fastened down, Spartacus and roughly 70 other gladiators fled. In 73 BCE, they captured thousands of escaped slaves and misfits in a matter of weeks, defeating Roman patrols. It developed into a movement, a full-fledged slave revolt at the very center of Rome's pride. Spartacus commanded this army of rebels for 2 years. They frightened the Senate, humiliated Roman generals, and routed well-trained troops. Spartacus resisted being seen as a footnote throughout it all. He was fighting back, not simply running away. It should come as no surprise, however, that the Romans do not tolerate humiliation for very long. Marcus Licinius Crassus comes on stage. Yes, the molten gold throat Crassus from our previous episode, who had to put an end to the uprising before it turned into a full-fledged revolution. In the end, Spartacus and his army found themselves surrounded in southern Italy, outnumbered all around, running low on supplies, no way out. Spartacus, however, refused to give up. He did what Spartacus always did instead. He struggled. He charged straight at Crassus, according to ancient chronicles, chopping through soldiers like a man who had no desire to go to sleep in peace. Despite being hurt, he was allegedly stabbed several times. He continued to fight until he disappeared in the chaos of combat. His remains were never located. No parade of triumph. The Roman steppes did not have a captured king, simply gone. Nevertheless, his tale persisted. As a warning, Rome crucified more than 6,000 of his supporters along the Appian Way. However, they were unable to deny that a man who began with kitchen knives had almost destroyed the prestige of their empire. Spartacus refused to fall. He did not simply die. And the echo of that type of ending is more powerful than the throne of any monarch. One name flickers momentarily before disappearing spectacularly in the turbulent twilight of the Roman Republic, when senators plotted over wine and civil wars erupted over lunch breaks. Lucius Junius Damasippus Brutus. Damasippus, a Roman general and ardent admirer of Marius, one half of the notorious Marius vs. Sulla dispute, was not well known. Imagine it as a political debate in Rome, but with swords and backup legions in place of microphones. Rome prepared for impact when Sulla brought his battle-hardened army back from the east. During Sulla's ruthless purging of his enemies, a political spring cleaning, but one that involved a lot more blood and fewer dustpans, Damasippus, who was devoted to the now-defeated Marians, was taken into custody. He was given the death penalty, along with a few other well-known inmates. However, this is where Damasippus justifies his inclusion on our list. One of the condemned men started crying and begging for his life as he and the others were being carried to their doom. Damasippus turned to him in panic and chuckled, "Why cry, fool? Did you not understand why we came here? That was the end of it. Just a caustic one-liner and a bold approach to the blade. No groveling, no last-minute dinner request." I've read the script and don't require a revision. That's the type of response that shouts. Damasippus opted for caustic sarcasm in a time when final remarks could be poetic, frantic, or filled with remorse. He approached death as though it were a routine committee meeting, mildly awkward, but not important enough to cause one to lose one's dignity. Did he make an excellent general? Maybe not. Has he altered the course of history? No, however, he left with greater poise than the majority of emperors, monarchs, or thinkers, and in the past that was sufficient at times. He approached the finale with a shrug, a joke, and perfect timing rather than with terror. Caligula would have been on the cover wearing a complete laurel crown if history had a lunchtime yearbook with a most likely to be assassinated section. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he began with promise and smiled. For a brief period in 37 CE, he appeared to be Rome's golden boy. He was the son of a combat hero, nurtured in the imperial palace and admired by the Roman populace and army. The cheese then completely slipped off the cracker. The reign of Caligula descended into a fever dream of delusion, psychosis, and government at the level of performance art. In addition to demanding to be worshipped as a god, he famously named his horse Incitatus, a senator. To be fair, the horse never showed up for a session, but he was said to have better dining manners than the majority of the senators, had a marble stable and a jeweled collar. Caligula declared war on Poseidon. Yes, the sea god executed senators for blinking suspiciously, and once gave his army orders to gather seashells as war booty. This was creative crazy, not simply lunacy. Even his closest guards eventually grew weary of evading his everyday demands. Rome was fed up with being governed by a man who believed that reality was optional, and his actions were erratic, and his penalties were theatrical. Therefore, in 41 CE, a gang of conspirators decided it was time for their own performance, led by members of his own security detail, the Praetorian Guard. They surrounded him in a passageway under the palace. Just slashing, no speeches, no beautiful farewells. A lot of it. According to one account, more than 30 injuries were sustained. It's a strongly phrased group project, not an assassination. They buried him in a shallow grave, the demise of a man who once attempted to replace statues of gods with monuments of himself. No honors, no state funeral. Caligula is still remembered, despite everything, for transforming Rome into a carnival and running it like a fever dream, not for wisdom or change. Surrounded by blades, deceived by his own, and likely thinking, "My horse could have run this place better," he died as dramatically as he had lived. To be honest, he may have been correct. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, experienced one of the most peculiarly specialized and wine-themed deaths in history. If the name seems familiar, it's because George was right in the heart of the Wars of the Roses, the messiest family rivalry in England. Imagine it as Game of Thrones in the 15th century, but with fewer dragons and more velvet hats. George was the older brother of Richard III, yes, that Richard III, and the younger brother of King Edward IV. George was also in line for the throne for a while. Unfortunately, ambition and a total lack of self-preservation were two of George's worst weaknesses. He made enemies more quickly than a medieval tax collector, plotted uprisings, and sided with whoever appeared to be the strongest that week throughout the Civil War. King Edward eventually had George jailed for treason after growing weary of his frequent, occasionally literal backstabbing. Edward had an issue now. How do you kill your own brother without making it appear like a public relations disaster? Presenting the most bizarre royal death remedy in English history. Chroniclers claim that when George was asked how he wanted to pass away, he reportedly chose to drown in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Take a moment to process that. Not an axe, not a gallows, not even a decent poisoned. He died doing what he loved, a barrel of wine full of it, as if he wanted his obituary to read. Was this lyrical, ironic, an over-the-top joke? Whether it actually occurred, or if it was a later satirical flourish, is still up for debate among historians. However, the picture stuck. Furthermore, even if it's overblown, it seems like something Clarence would have asked for. Expensive, messy, and a little absurd. He was buried at Westminster Abbey, most likely completely sober by that time, and was mostly forgotten save from his rather ostentatious death. Therefore, keep this in mind if you ever feel like there is drama in your family. At least no one has been charged with treason, given a wine barrel death sentence, and become the most drinkable cautionary tale in England. That's a classic conclusion. We conclude our exploration of legendary exits with a story that demonstrates that genius is no defense against poor timing. The greatest thinker in ancient Greece, Archimedes, was cruelly killed by a man who had little interest in geometry. Archimedes was an inventor, engineer, and mathematician. Basically, the type of guy who could learn fluid dynamics by looking at a puddle. In addition to creating war machines, levers, and pulleys, he is said to have once used enormous mirrors to defend Syracuse from Roman ships by reflecting sunlight. The man was unquestionably sharp, whether or not that last statement is accurate. Regretfully, he was socially awkward. After a bloody and protracted siege, Syracuse was finally taken by the Romans in 212 BCE. Troops surged into the city, screaming, looting, and looking for adversaries. Archimedes was hunched over a diagram in the sand on the ground. Deep in contemplation, he was sketching, most likely figuring out some timeless truth about spirals, catapults, or the number of camels needed to fill a bath. A Roman soldier came up. Nowadays, most people would get up, greet a man with a sword, and perhaps say something like, "Please don't kill me." Archimedes, however, did not. According to legend, all he did was look up and say, "Don't bother my circles." That was it. No introduction, no entreaty, just a clear demarcation of his geometry. The soldier immediately executed him, possibly because he was upset, puzzled, or just didn't like math. One of the greatest minds in history ended in a nonchalant, almost bureaucratic manner. The Roman general Marcellus became enraged upon learning of it. He had issued stern directives to spare Archimedes. The man was too smart and too important to be wasted. Unfortunately, a confused foot soldier with a negative attitude is more formidable than brilliance. It has an odd, poetic quality. The inventor of the screw pump and the guy who computed the volume of irregular shapes, Archimedes, was killed, not by another brilliant person, but by someone who most likely had no idea what a hypotenuse was. Thus, mid-equation, one of the brightest lights in history, was extinguished. That should serve as a lesson. Perhaps take a quick look up sometimes if you're working on a major idea, particularly during an invasion. There were many benefits to becoming royalty, including velvet robes, limitless feasts, and access to a private choir. However, it did not have back support, as King Henry of France discovered in the 11th century. Henry wasn't exactly crazy now. He did not throw orgies in the throne room or ride into combat bare-chested. He was essentially a unicorn in medieval Europe, since he was a comparatively stable king. From 1031 until 1060 he ruled, put down a few common uprisings, reared a family, and occasionally erected a church. Nothing overly ostentatious. However, he will always be remembered for his departure rather than his reign. According to the myth, King Henry once rose up too soon after sitting for a long time, possibly in prayer, or, more likely, right after a lengthy royal meeting, and that was the end of it. He fell. It might be an aneurysm, a stroke, or simply gravity taking control. Whatever it was, he passed away soon after. To be fair, diagnostic accuracy wasn't exactly a hallmark of 11th century medicine. The local doctor most likely suggested quick bleeding, murmured something about bad humor, and waved some herbs over his chest. It didn't work. Spoiler alert. As a result, the King of France was among the first people to be known to suffer from orthostatic hypertension, which is the strange dizziness that occurs when you stand up too quickly and suddenly see stars. It wasn't only dizziness in his situation. It was the closing credits. You may be thinking that for a monarch, dying after rising is a bit too unimpressive. But think about the meaning. A quick shift in attitude brought down a man who had governed for decades despite wars, conspiracies, and plague. Leg cramps can happen to even rulers, as history has whispered. Sesshu Toyo chose a more subdued legacy, one composed of ink, silence, and incredible patience in medieval Japan, when honor was frequently measured in dramatic exits and sword swings. Sesshu, who was born in 1420, grew up in a monastery, had Zen monastic training, and was expected to live a life of meditation, humility, and sweeping defects like most monks. Sesshu, however, had an issue. Drawing was his passion, obsessively, constantly, especially when he shouldn't have. There is also a well-known tale of how, as a boy, after being disciplined and bound for failing to perform his responsibilities, he used his toe to sketch a mouse on the floor that was so realistic that the monks were said to be shocked. Yes, he had jump scares in his detention doodling. Later, Sesshu went to China to learn about the origins of ink painting. His powerful, flowing, and emotionally charged style transformed Japanese art forever when he returned to Japan. Trees with more personality than most dinner guests, mountains that appeared to float in mist, and landscapes that seemed to have been breathed into the paper. As he aged, he painted traditional Zen themes of emptiness and nature. However, Sesshu just continued painting, in contrast to the samurai of his time, who frequently perished tragically in combat or committed ritual suicide. And with a brush in hand, he confronted death as he faced life when the time came. According to legend, Sesshu requested ink and paper as he lay dying in 1506. His last deed? As if to convey the message, this is sufficient. There is only one bold stroke, one final line on the page, and it is straightforward, intense, and enigmatic. There is no signature or explanation, just a brushstroke to indicate the exit. He didn't poison himself beneath a cherry tree or die in a sword fight. Instead, he painted till the very end and let the ink to speak where words could not. It was a peaceful death, but an epic one if you know what it's like to leave a masterpiece unnoticed. Thus, keep Sesshu in mind the next time life seems too loud. The last word can occasionally be merely a line. Saigo Takamori is the person your mind was stealing from if you've ever thought of a samurai's death as noble, dramatic, and encased in cherry blossoms. Saigo, who was born in 1828, progressed through the ranks as a skilled fighter, a politician, and ultimately a hesitant revolutionary. He was a key figure in the Meiji Restoration, which modernized Japan, ended the feudal system, and, regrettably, rendered samurai as obsolete as a fax machine in the age of smartphones. Saigo did not adapt like many other samurai did. Saigo became the silent face of dissatisfaction as reforms swept through Japan, outlawing swords, samurai stipends, and anything else that rhymed with tradition. He was at the forefront of the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. What started out as a protest escalated into a conflict. With a few thousand devoted fighters, Saigo marched against the imperial army, which was now equipped with artillery, firearms, and a lot less sentimental values. Saigo refused to back down despite the fact that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and obviously doomed after months of fighting. Finally, the last stand was made at the Battle of Shiroyama. Saigo turned to his remaining men, surrounded, wounded, and seeing his army disintegrate. What happened next is still up for discussion. Was he too hurt and requested a devoted disciple to put an immediate stop to it, or did he engage in seppuku, the samurai ceremonial suicide? In any case, he passed away facing the future he had contributed to but no longer belonged to, his sword by his side. After mourning him, Japan instantly turned him into a legend. The government that overthrew him then granted him a posthumous pardon, erected statues in his honor, and started praising him to kids as though they had never fired a cannon at him in the first place. As the guy who stood up for honor in a world that had moved on, Saigo became the ideal tragic icon. Sometimes all it takes to become eternal is to lose like a legend. Winning is not always necessary. Jesse James, the man holding a revolver in one hand and a train timetable in the other, was more than just an outlaw. He was the embodiment of American rebellion. Jesse James, who was born in Missouri in 1847, began his career as a Confederate guerrilla warrior, burning property that wasn't his and robbing Union soldiers. He went from rebel to full-time legend after the war, heading the James Younger Gang on a 10-year crime rampage that included rail robberies, stagecoach stick-ups, and bank heists throughout the Midwest of the United States. He was a nightmare for the banks and a nightmare for the journalists. A wandering target with a bounty large enough to undermine trust in any group of friends, according to most law enforcement. This leads us to Robert Ford, Jesse's gang member and alleged friend, who was just offered a $10,000 reward and a pardon for his assistance in bringing Jesse in, alive or dead. Jesse James was living under a false identity in St. Joseph, Missouri in April 1882, like housemates, but with more loaded weapons and less boundaries. Robert Ford and his brother were residing with him. On the morning of April 3rd, Jesse removed his rare pistols and climbed up on a chair to dust the wall with a framed photo, a touch too quiet for a domestic time. Mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-dusting, Ford pulled out his pistol, aimed it at Jesse's back, and fired a shot into his head. In a way, it feels both epic and remarkably ordinary that the Wild West figure fell from a chair while a home task was still unfinished. As a hero, Robert Ford anticipated being praised. Rather, he was widely hated. Jesse was good, but that didn't make the audience love him. He was brazen, which is why they adored him. And murdering him in that manner, it lacked courage, it was practical. Jesse James was betrayed by a man who was drinking his coffee, and he died in his socks rather than in a dramatic gunfight or a flurry of gunshots. History isn't always a high-noon duel. There are instances where someone just turned away, and someone else was unable to resist the reward. Just know this if you haven't heard of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He had a name that sounded like it should have its own locomotive. He wore a top hat, and he created half of Victorian Britain. Brunel, who was born in 1806, was the type of brilliant person who casually redefined what an impossible undertaking looked like and drew bridges while eating breakfast. He constructed railroads that traveled quicker than common sense permitted, suspension bridges across valleys and tunnels beneath rivers. But what was his greatest dream? Vessels. Large ones. Enormous ones. Brunel created the enormous steamship SS Great Eastern in the middle of the 19th century, which made other ships appear like bath toys. It was more than 700 feet long, propelled by a screw propeller and paddle wheels, and built to sail from England to Australia without the need for refueling. Unfortunately, it was cursed from the beginning as well. Workers lost their lives while it was being built. There were fires. An attempt at launch was unsuccessful. Twice. Before being saved, one man was actually stuck behind a hull panel for days. The spacecraft had to be launched sideways because it was so hefty, which sounds awesome until you realize it nearly destroyed a warehouse. During all of this, Brunel, who was already under stress and chewing cigars like they were oxygen, suffered a stroke. Not just anywhere, but aboard the ship itself as they saw a new engine room innovation being demonstrated. Some claim that the ridiculous weight of expectation killed him, while others claim that stress did. In any event, he passed only a few days prior to the ship's inaugural trip in 1859. The worst part is still to come. The ship detonated during that initial voyage. One of the steam pipes burst. There were 6 fatalities. It made it through the journey, but the dream, it's already cracked. Although Brunel's death was poetic, it was not as dramatic as a war or betrayal. He was destroyed by his own genius, pushing the boundaries of human construction and forgetting that fate and physics don't always work together. Therefore, Brunel was practically outlived by a floating tower that almost fell on top of his legacy when most people are buried in peace. Still, tunnels hold, bridges stand, and the hat legendary. The most spectacular deaths occasionally occur when your dreams are a bit too lofty and reality doesn't blink. The environment in which Cleopatra Selene II was born was rife with political conflict, myth, and ambition. The final Egyptian pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, was her mother and portrayed herself as the living goddess Isis. Her father was the renowned general Mark Antony of Rome, who struggled between his love for the Queen of Egypt and his allegiance to the Republic. Selene was more than a kid from the time of her birth in 40 BCE. She served as a living reminder that Egypt and Rome might coexist as partners rather than enemies. Alexandria, the city of wonders, is where she was born. Imagine growing up beneath tall obelisks and marble colonnades where philosophers debated beneath star charts and priests chanted in ancient tongues. The cult of Isis was still strong, and the Alexandrian library was still alive. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Roman politics, and royal education were all imparted to Selene and her twin brother Alexander Helios. She was born into a political trap despite the ceremony and incense, but she also learned to walk a line that few people could even notice. The Eastern Mediterranean had been divided like a wedding cake by Cleopatra and Antony, who gave their children lofty titles without any actual forces to support them. Before she could even talk, little Selene was anointed Queen of Libya and Cyrenaica. The moon would soon need to learn how to survive in the dark, yet her name meant moon, twin to her brother's sun. All of this was observed with icy calculation by Octavian, who would ultimately become Augustus back in Rome. In addition to being scandalous, Antony's union with Cleopatra was traitorous. Adult decisions over which Selene had little influence sealed her fate when war broke out between Octavian and Antony. She saw her world fall apart when she was just 10 years old. Her parents suffered a terrible defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Her father committed suicide. Her mother, who famously preferred a cobra's bite over a Roman procession, came next. Then everything was different. Once held in gold, Selene was now an orphan and a prisoner of the same guy who had ruined her family. However, she didn't scream or pass out. Although history doesn't tell us what she said, it does reveal what she would do next. In the midst of tragedy, she took a step that few royal offspring took. She lived. And that was just the start. Cleopatra Selene, who was just 10 years old, was transported across the Mediterranean as a military trophy once the dust fell from Alexandria. She came to Rome as a representation of Octavian's victory rather than as a princess. In a terrifying scene, she and her brothers were paraded around the streets. Now orphans, the children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, were seen walking in the shadow of the man who had destroyed their dynasty while wearing gold chains. Take a time to imagine that. The god's daughter displayed like treasure. She was humiliated in the same streets where Julius Caesar had previously been praised. Selene, however, did not cry. There are no records of tears or rebellion. Expecting a crying youngster, the Roman audience was taken aback by a small girl who exuded an uncanny composure. Some claim that the audience felt sorry for her. Furthermore, sympathy might be stronger than fear in ancient Rome. The future Augustus, Octavian, was not a fool. His carefully constructed reputation of refinement and charity would be tarnished if he killed Antony and Cleopatra's children. Thus, he gave them to his sister, Octavia, who was Antony's ex-wife as well. A terrible turn of events? Of course. However, it ended up being a hidden advantage. Selene received safety, education, and, surprisingly, a second opportunity under Octavia's house. Selene was now under the guardianship of the woman whose marriage Antony had betrayed. Octavia was more than just a politician. Selene was brought up with Roman discipline, Greek intelligence, and just enough Egyptian dignity to remind everyone whose daughter she was. She was renowned for her grace and restraint. The young queen-in-waiting watched from here, in the center of Rome. She researched survival politics. She became aware of when to speak and when to use quiet as a tactic. She read the tales of a people who had destroyed her ancestry, studied rhetoric, and became an expert in Latin. She observed how Roman women rose to positions of authority by marriage, intrigue, and guile rather than crowns. Selene adjusted as her brothers vanished into obscurity. She didn't use swords to battle Rome, she understood it and battled it. She discovered that in order to survive, she had to become essential to the system that had attempted to eradicate her. She was a Romanized princess, a ward in public. Behind those cunning eyes, however, was a girl secretly planning her comeback to the global scene, not in defiance, but through something more riskier, marriage. The transition of Cleopatra Selene from prisoner to queen was not forced. It was achieved by strategy. Rome was changing the globe to fit her image as she approached adolescence, and client kings were being positioned throughout its enormous empire like chess pieces. Ever the political puppet master, Augustus regarded Selene as both a threat and a chance. He therefore took a determined action. He got her married. King Juba II of Mauritania, her husband, was a scholar king who had grown up in Rome. His father, a monarch from North Africa, had sided with Julius Caesar, but lost everything after Caesar's death. Juba, like Selene, had grown up in Octavia's home after being displayed as a prisoner child. He was Roman to the core, clever and well-behaved. He was essentially a safe investment for Augustus, a monarch who was faithful to Rome, yet sufficiently alien to govern its far-flung territories. The union was only one aspect of the marriage. It was a masterwork of diplomacy. Having been delivered to Rome as spoils, two royal offspring of vanquished civilizations are now put together as the rulers of a kingdom they did not request. Nevertheless, it was successful. Selene rose to become Queen of Mauritania, which is now Algeria and Morocco. It was a culturally rich but politically unstable region, and Selene reigned as a visionary ruler rather than a puppet. Selene and Juba worked together to change the name of their capital city, Isle, to Caesarea, in honor of Augustus. It was more than just a name change, though. The city blossomed into a brilliant fusion of Greek art, Roman engineering, and Egyptian opulence under Selene's influence. In a subtle but impactful homage to her heritage, temples were constructed, libraries were established, and coins featuring her wearing the solar crown of Egyptian monarchy were struck. Selene wasn't merely acting like the queen, a whole region was being impacted by her. He considered himself a historian and geographer, while Juba concentrated on writing and diplomacy. Statecraft was brought by Selene. She oversaw commerce, supported the arts, and gave the kingdom a distinct hybrid character that was all her own. Here, away from the shadow of Rome and the ruins of Alexandria, Cleopatra Selene did more than simply survive. She flourished. Once destroyed by politics and violence, her life had transformed into a story of silent reclamation, uncommon in the ancient world. She had lost her status as a symbol. She wasn't done yet, and she was a sovereign. Being a ceremonial figure or Juba's passive consort was not enough for Cleopatra Selene. Born into an empire, she had been honed by shame and taught by tragedy. She now presented a queen who united three cultures into a single vision, something Rome had never seen before, with a kingdom at stake and a throne beneath her. A crossroads of cultures has long existed in Mauritania. Its coasts were plagued by Phoenician traders, Berber tribes, and Carthaginian ghosts. However, this mosaic became intentional under Selene. She did not completely submit to Roman preferences or enforce Egyptian domination. Rather, she purposefully and ingeniously combined them. She was in charge of the marketplaces, temples, harbors, and enormous public works. Roman aqueducts wound their way through Egyptian-inspired cities. Isis statues were located close to Roman forums. African-style workmanship flourished alongside Greek theatres. Instead of confusion, harmony was the end outcome. A kingdom that was both faithful to Rome and distinctively its own, it felt both old and modern. Selene was visible throughout it all. For a queen in a client kingdom, this was unusual. Wearing royal regalia reminiscent of Ptolemaic queens, she was shown on coins beside to her husband rather than behind him. The vulture crown and the sun disk are representations of heavenly authority. They were silent proclamations. Even though Egypt had fallen, she still felt the blood of its ancestors. Above all, Selene saw diplomacy as an art form. Despite playing Rome's game, she refrained from letting it control her. She supposedly assisted in the kingdom's taxation policies, particularly in fostering riches through trade with the Mediterranean, welcomed emissaries, and oversaw grain exports. Under her leadership, Mauritania developed into a useful Roman ally, not because it was a submissive state, but rather because it operated effectively and economically. Additionally, Selene provided the higher classes of Rome nothing salacious to jump on as they gossiped about her exotic ancestry and her notorious mother's legacy. No intrigues, no rebellions, only development, harmony, and subdued power. But despite her success, Alexandria's memories persisted. She never forgot her father's sword, the cobra in the basket, or the fall of her dynasty. However, she incorporated that lost legacy into her rule rather than bringing it back to life. Her realm turned into a synthesis sanctuary. Egypt was not rebuilt by her. On Berber soil, thousands of miles away, she reinvented it. She also established her own dynasty in Mauritania. The middle ground had always been Cleopatra Selene's home. Her ancestry was Egyptian, her upbringing was Roman, and her reign is now North African. But instead of picking just one identity, she became proficient in all three. She was a daughter of Isis, a Hellenistic scholar, a Roman matron, and a leader of desert tribes. She was both and more in every part she performed. However, this dualism was more than just a shrewd political ploy. It was a matter of survival. Selene was aware of the consequences for women who leaned too much toward ambition. In Roman eyes, her mother died a villain because she had done so. She was aware that Rome preferred submissive, not bold, queens. Thus, she maintained her composure and regal demeanor while walking a tightrope. She didn't seek out controversy, she pursued power. Symbolism was one of her most effective techniques. Her picture was more than ornamental on Mauritanian coins. She restored the Egyptian pharaoh's solar crown and combined it with Latin inscriptions, laurel wreaths, togas, and Roman styles. These coins were used all over Africa and the Mediterranean, subtly reminding merchants, aristocrats, and Roman officials that Cleopatra's blood still controlled, and that her power extended beyond beauty. Selene promoted the blending of religions. Mauritania allowed the cult of Isis to thrive. However, African spirits and Roman gods like Jupiter were also indigenous to the area. This was not tolerance for religion, political unity was the cause. She was aware of what Augustus had accomplished in Rome by bringing a varied populace together around a common pantheon. In her own realm, she now quietly followed suit. Despite her poise and grace, Selene was never merely a supporting character for her husband. Archaeological findings and modern narratives indicate she was crucial in court rulings. According to some historians, she even presided over grain fleets, issued decrees, and arbitrated tribe conflicts while Jupiter was away. She was more than a monarch. She was a power partner. What's even more amazing is that she accomplished all of this without going to war. Stability, which was uncommon in antiquity, and especially more so for a woman of her ancestry, characterized Cleopatra Selene's reign. She didn't have to take over territories. She overcame fantasies. She had once been paraded as a prize in Rome. She was now a sovereign whose name, not out of fear, but because of her intelligence, inspired respect in both senators and merchants. Despite having every motivation to seek revenge, the queen decided to use strategy instead. The greatest enduring legacy of Cleopatra Selene II, the Queen of Mauritania, started to take shape as she grew used to her position, not in marble or coin, but in her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania. Ptolemy, the last of a once glorious lineage that spanned from Macedonian conquerors to Egyptian gods, was born into this delicately balanced monarchy. Selene wanted to ensure that all she had reconstructed from rubble would continue through him. She brought him up as a living example of empire, not just a prince. As befitted someone with blood ties to both Julius Caesar and the Ptolemies, Ptolemy had an excellent education. He studied Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious rites, Latin law, and, above all, diplomacy from his mother, who was the best teacher he could have. The youngster probably reminded Selene of herself. He was born into a game of political chess, just like her. He would have to make it through a world where ancestry might be both a blessing and a curse, just like her. Ptolemy, however, had the advantage of stability in contrast to her, having grown up in a kingdom that his mother had already shaped into a haven of harmony. Selene wasn't naive, though. She trained him with the instruments of politics, culture, and negotiation rather than swords, because she had witnessed how swiftly dynasties collapse when heirs become weak or careless. She made certain that he would speak both literally and figuratively the languages of power. Perhaps most intriguing, though, is the fact that Selene never attempted to use her son to bring Egypt back to life. She was more aware. The world was different now. Because of Augustus's strict control, any attempt to resurrect ancient claims would be crushed. Rather, through temples, iconography, and customs, she subtly infused Egypt into Mauritania's spirit and transmitted that subtle legacy to Ptolemy. For a while at least, her plan worked. After his father's death, Ptolemy became king in his own right. He was recognized, tolerated, and even given honorary consulship in Rome. Because he truly was a prince of the blood, he was treated as such. Selene had done what her parents were unable to do through Ptolemy. Without any bloodshed, she made sure their line would survive. Her child represented adaptation rather than failure, and her silent dominion survived a little while longer thanks to him. The boisterous, the invaders, the revolutionaries, and the insane rulers are frequently favored in history. However, Cleopatra Selene's legacy was whispered. There are no surviving theatrical speeches or scrolls containing her ideas. Her imprint, however, may be found in the coinage, the cities, the laws, and the silent continuation of a once doomed dynasty. Selene disappeared from Roman chronicles as she moved into the last years of her rule. While some historians see this silence as political erasure, others think she intentionally chose to keep it quiet. After all, being visible in Rome had a cost, particularly for a woman of her lineage. Maybe she wanted to be in the background, unseen, powerful, and impervious to scandal. Her life had no documented scandals, betrayals, affairs, or executions carried out under duress. That's impressive in and of itself. Without ever giving her adversaries a footing, Selene negotiated a world characterized by shifting alliances, cultural bias, and male egos. She saw power as something to be used quietly rather than to show off. And maybe she was getting even with that subtlety. Her refusal to seek revenge might have been one of her most potent deeds. She never attempted to retake Egypt in contrast to her mother. She didn't rebel against Rome or oppose Augustus. Rather, she made sure that her people, those who remembered the ancient gods or who had followed her from Alexandria, were provided with safety in her hybrid realm. Archaeological discoveries indicate that during Mauritania's rule, religious customs were merged. Egyptian funerary art was discovered next to Roman mosaics, and shrines to Isis in North Africa were nested next to altars to Jupiter. Her silent hand held the spiritual mosaic together. She even had an impact on Caesarea, the capital city. Its soul reflected her, even though it was named after Augustus. Local crafts were given state-sponsored status, public works blossomed, and architecture exuded Hellenistic grace. Alexandria was not being rebuilt by her. She had outgrown it. But there was always the memory of her father, shamed and fallen, of a city lost, a dynasty destroyed, a family almost wiped out, and her mother, exalted and despised. These things were not mentioned by Selene. She has no voice in history. She didn't have to, though. Her stillness had its own language. In an unpublished memoir, every decision she took, temple she supported and sign she wore, was a sentence. Her outcomes were remembered, but her words were forgotten. Then she disappeared. The records of Cleopatra Selene II, queen, daughter of two legends and ruler of a realm constructed in cultural gold, just vanish. No Roman historian believed her last days were worth recording, and no triumphal obituary or preserved grave existed. Her demise came like a dying candle to someone who was born amidst the fireworks of history. Given the sudden disappearance of her name from official records and currency, we can place her death around 5 BCE. She co-ruled Mauritania one day. Only Jupiter too was shown on the next one. Not much fanfare. No inscription of funeral. Nothing but quiet. However, that quiet is telling. One of two things was frequently implied by a silent departure in ancient royal circles. Either someone had a motive to eliminate her, or she passed away naturally and was privately mourned. And all are feasible, given the political tightrope she walked for decades. There isn't even a trace of scandal, though. After her passing, Jupiter remained in power, but Mauritania never again shone as brilliantly. He remarried to a Cappadocian princess named Glaphyra. However, that marriage ended abruptly and left a far smaller inheritance. Jupiter was a devoted ruler and author, yet there was a sense of dimmerness about the kingdom. It appeared that Selene had been more than just queen. She had been the court's lifeblood. Following in the footsteps of his parents, her son Ptolemy would also meet a tragic end when, decades later, Emperor Caligula had him executed in Rome for reasons that are still up for controversy. Cleopatra Selene's lineage genuinely terminated with him. Her fingerprints were still there, though. Coins with her crowned portrait were still in circulation. For generations, the Egyptian cult she had backed persisted in North Africa. Under Roman control, the cities she shaped, like Caesarea, became centers of study and trade. Her legacy persisted in the long, gradual transformation of civilization rather than in loud claps. She established a kingdom but lacked an epic mausoleum. Despite not leaving behind any well-known speeches, her initiatives transformed lives. Although she didn't raise any troops, she was able to bring order to the chaos her parents had left behind. Cleopatra Selene disappeared from the page, but only because she had already made her mark on empire. Perhaps this was her last great achievement, to disappear not as a victim of history, but as its creator. Even though Cleopatra Selene II passed away quietly, her narrative didn't stop there. Her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, a prince who personified centuries of aspiration, legend, and perseverance, carried on her inheritance. He was the last known descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last surviving relic of the Egyptian pharaohs and generals of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy was raised in the refined society his mother had contributed to creating, and he inherited a kingdom as well as a precarious political inheritance. Fluent in Greek, Latin, and diplomacy, he was young, rich, and Romanized. Despite not being as revolutionary as his mother's, his reign in Mauritania was distinguished by his steadfast devotion to Rome and ongoing prosperity. However, as a client ruler with royal lineage, too magnificent for Rome to overlook, he walked a precarious balance. He did a good job in his duties at first. He was made a Roman senator by Augustus, and he was thereafter invited to court by emperors. He received accolades for his affluence, kindness, and refined way of living. The man ate with emperors and, as was his prerogative, donned purple. However, a hint of jealousy accompanied each gesture of goodwill. Rome never trusted inheritance, especially under uncertain rulers, and Ptolemy had what many Roman nobility feared, ancient legitimacy. Caligula, the infamously unpredictable emperor, was responsible for his downfall. Perhaps too much for Caligula's frail ego, Ptolemy supposedly traveled to Rome in 40 CE while clad in royal magnificence. Caligula claimed that Rome could only accommodate one monarch according to historical accounts. Ptolemy was put to death shortly after. No war, no trial, just abrupt erasure. His passing ultimately put an end to the dynasties of Cleopatra, Alexander, and Isis. The lineage that formerly dominated the world's most scholarly city came to an end at the whim of a paranoid emperor, rather than through conflict or rebellion. However, Ptolemy's passing, like that of his mother, did not negate their impact. Despite being restructured and incorporated as a Roman province, Mauritania retained the cities, temples, and mixed cultures that Selene had sketched. She influenced the earth, even in death. Furthermore, Rome never really succeeded in burying the monarchy. The myth of the Ptolemies was born through legacy, culture, and her son's fleeting but dazzling spark. Cleopatra Selene, once paraded as a trophy of war, had outlasted her foes. Even when the last Ptolemy fell, her name, her symbols, and her silent strength were still present in the world he inherited. Clay was cold, heavy, and strangely timeless before the days of written texts and the ink-soaked scrolls of Alexandria. A king who wished to be remembered for knowledge rather than conquering constructed the oldest known library in human history, which was etched in cuneiform on top of that clay. Greetings from Nineveh. It is approximately 650 BCE. Ashurbanipal, the self-proclaimed king of the world and ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, is the monarch. However, Ashurbanipal wasn't content with temples and war trophies like the most of his contemporaries were. He desired a repository for all human knowledge, something deeper. He commissioned the construction of a vast knowledge base in the center of his royal complex. Ashurbanipal's library was more than just a closet. It was a purposeful endeavor to gather, arrange, and preserve Mesopotamia's intellectual legacy. And we intend to confiscate, copy, and catalogue when we say collect. To obtain texts from priests, intellectuals, and scribes, royal operatives were sent throughout the empire. Over 30,000 clay tablets were housed in the library by the time it was finished. Astrology, medicine, religious rites, regal decrees, legal codes, dictionaries, even directions for exorcism and love ballads. The oldest known copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in meticulous lines on baked clay, was seated among them. By genre and purpose, each tablet was labeled, sorted, and stored in a different room. A rudimentary referencing system was even included in Ashurbanipal's library, with labels engraved into the tablets indicating the proper placement of each text. Long before librarians created card systems, it may be referred to as a proto-catalogue. What about Ashurbanipal? At least he said he had read them. He claimed to be literate in Sumerian and Akkadian, two languages that were already old in his day, in contrast to most other kings. According to his inscriptions, I have read the cryptic Sumerian tablets and the difficult-to-learn Akkadian language. This treasure windfall, however, would not last. The palace was destroyed by fire when a group of Babylonians and Medes overran Nineveh in 612 BCE. Ironically, the fire locked the words in place and baked several tablets hard, preserving them. The charred remains were discovered by archaeologists thousands of years later. They discovered a king's dream, a clay time capsule of human memory, obstinately refusing to vanish in that silence. Assyria chiseled knowledge into clay, while the Egyptians engraved their knowledge into papyrus, which was incomparably more beautiful. They used it to construct the House of Life, a combination of a temple, scriptorium, and archive that is considered to be among the first literary sanctuaries in the world. Priests, scribes, and intellectuals protected the secrets of civilization in these hallowed places, which were not public libraries in the contemporary sense. The House of Life, which was situated at important temple complexes such as Abydos, Thebes, and Edfu, was regarded as a living institution that was closely associated with the gods, particularly Thoth, the deity of magic, writing, and wisdom. Within were astronomical records, medical manuals, legal documents, administrative duties, burial spells, mythological songs, and manuscripts painstakingly written by hand by scribes. It was thought that each scroll contained divine power in addition to words. Slow, repetitive, and sacred was the nature of the task. From an early age, scribes received instruction in hieroglyphics and hieratic script. Papyrus was delicate and valuable, and it must only be kept in dry, carefully controlled conditions. A mistake was not merely a scribal blunder, it was a spiritual failure. Scrolls were labelled with tags and string and stored in pottery jars or wooden boxes. Though none of them have survived in any form, each House of Life had its own classification scheme. The most well-known instance was probably at Perank at Thebes, where royal medical manuscripts were copied and kept for many centuries. The Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text that contained cures, incantations, and surgical instructions, was probably created and passed down there. However, these libraries were quite difficult to access. They were aristocratic workshops for priests and royal councillors rather than centres of public enlightenment. In Egypt, power was fiercely guarded and knowledge was power. Your religious role, social status, or destiny in the hereafter may all be influenced by your knowledge, particularly if it involved spells from the Book of the Dead. Nevertheless, during dynasty transition, drought, and conquest, these establishments maintained Egypt's cultural character by acting as links between successive generations of scribes. The Houses of Life, Greeks, Romans, and Persians vanished when invaders arrived. Their manuscripts burnt, decayed, or disappeared. However, pieces are preserved in tombs interred with mummies or dispersed via commerce. Ancient Egypt's knowledge persisted, spoken in ink on fragile papyrus. It simply slid between the historical cracks, just waiting to be revealed. Babylon had her own information empire based on bricks, stars, and divine order, long before contemporary catalogues. Babylon had its own educational institutions spread among temples, ziggurats, and royal courts, although Ashurbanipal's library was the most well-known. In this context, libraries were more than just textual repositories. They were cosmic blueprints that held the secrets of calendars, monarchs, and gods. The temples of Asagala and Izida, which housed priest scholars known as Umanu, were the center of Babylonian scholarship. Their libraries were small, robust, and extremely specialized, and these individuals were not just scribes but also mathematicians, astronomers, healers, and astrologers. Like old-fashioned filing cabinets, clay tablets containing lists, omens, calculations, and rites were meticulously piled in clay jars or pigeonholed into walls. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a comprehensive compilation of heavenly omens, was among the most noteworthy Babylonian contributions. It documented observations of planets and stars spanning thousands of years, connected to forecasts of prosperity, plague, or war. These books weren't only scholarly, they were examined before to coronations, conflicts, and royal choices. These tablets were oracles in a world of signs. And astronomy wasn't the only thing Babylon did. They had mathematical works in their libraries that illustrated early algebra and sophisticated geometry. For example, trigonometric computations found on the Plimpton 322 tablet date back more than a millennium before Greek mathematics. It seems to contemporary academics like the first draft of a calculus textbook. Colophons were little inscriptions at the end of tablets used by Babylonian scribes that included the name of the scribe, the source, and occasionally cautions against stealing or abusing the information. In the ancient world, these were intellectual property rights rather than merely records. However, after Babylon was conquered by Hittites, Persians, and Greeks, the library began to deteriorate. Under centuries of dust, many tablets were smashed or robbed, their pieces strewn amid piles of debris. Some were preserved by the arid climate, but the most were buried and forgotten until thousands were discovered during excavations in the 19th century. These tablets communicated even after they were damaged. They included spells, rules, recipes, and the movements of stars in bits no larger than a hand. They demonstrated that the Mesopotamian people had developed a poetic and practical knowledge system even before Aristotle or Euclid. Even if the shelves of Babylon have fallen, its clay voices continue to reverberate from the remains. Alexandria was the capital of the knowledge in antiquity, if there existed such a place. The Great Library of Alexandria served as the focal point of this Egyptian-Greek city, which was established by Alexander the Great and governed by the Ptolemies, his successors. The Library of Alexandria was more than just a structure. It was a sanctuary for the Muses, housed in the temple complex known as the Mausoleum in the 3rd century BCE. To gather every book, scroll, every bit of information the planet has to give was a dream. For local scholars, it was hardly a peaceful space. It was an empire of ideas. Agents were dispatched around the Mediterranean to purchase or duplicate scrolls from every port under monarchs such as Ptolemy the Farm and Ptolemy II. Scrolls found on board ships that anchored at Alexandria were confiscated, copied, and kept in storage. Even foreign texts were translated into Greek, including Babylonian astronomy, Indian treatises, and Hebrew scriptures. There may have been between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls in the library, according to estimates. Philosophy, medicine, engineering, poetry, botany, history, and everything else were covered. This is where Homer's works were edited. Ideas from Archimedes flowed through its walls. It was so accurate that even the librarian Eratosthenes used it to determine the circumference of the planet. The library was more than just a repository. It had to do with rectification. Here, academics compared text versions, found mistakes, and produced the first critical editions. They questioned the remainder and kept the best. However, Alexandria's genius also made it brittle. Politics, conflicts, and fires eroded its shelves of scrolls. The first significant setback may have occurred in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar's army, stranded in Alexandria's harbour, unintentionally set fire to portions of the library complex and enemy ships. Alexandria later turned into a battlefield of beliefs as the Roman Empire grew stronger. Gnostic, pagan, Christian, and its library all suffered. What was left is unknown at the time of the Muslim invasion in 642 CE. According to some accounts, Caliph Umar ordered its destruction, arguing that the texts were unnecessary if they agreed with the Quran. They are heretical otherwise. Historians disagree as to whether the library had disappeared centuries earlier. One thing is for sure, the vast library has vanished. There are no scrolls left. Nevertheless, its mythology endures, demonstrating that the concept of a universal library was too potent to be entirely destroyed. Alexandria came to represent both what humanity had and, sadly, what it had lost. As Alexandria revelled in its renown, a rival city was covertly constructing a library that would subvert its hegemony and transform writing itself. That city was Pergamon, which is in present-day Turkey. The Library of Pergamon was at the heart of Pergamon's transformation into a cultural powerhouse during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE under the Attalid dynasty. King Eumenes II established the library, which was rumoured to contain more than 200,000 scrolls, second only to Alexandria. However, it went beyond the figures. Quality, meticulously chosen texts, immaculate organisation, and a scholarly atmosphere that fostered historical recording, medical progress, and philosophical reflection were all priorities for Pergamon. Additionally, parchment was a crucial advantage. According to legend, the Ptolemies of Egypt outlawed the export of papyrus in order to deprive their adversary of writing materials after learning of Pergamon's ascent. In response, Pergamon improved the application of parchment, pergamenum, or animal skin. Although it wasn't completely new, Pergamon scribes transformed it into a smoother, more resilient surface that was more moisture-resistant than papyrus. Everything altered with this technical breakthrough. Eventually, scrolls grew more portable, durable, and long-lasting. It was a turning point in the development of the codex, the forerunner of the contemporary book, from the scroll. The Pergamon library was an academic hive rather than only a repository. It promoted medical advancements, particularly early surgical research, and drew philosophers from the Stoic and Peripatetic schools. One of the most well-known doctors in antiquity, Galen, was born in Pergamon and might have examined library materials. There was a sort of intellectual arms race between Pergamon and Alexandria. Scholars were enticed by status, housing, and pay. Cities competed in wisdom rather than combat, and rulers became patrons of knowledge. For a short while, it was the heyday of conservation and collection. Pergamon's scrolls will eventually suffer an odd destiny. According to legend, Mark Antony gave Pergamon's library, scrolls, and everything else to Alexandria as a token of his love for her when he married Cleopatra. Regardless of its veracity, this story illustrates how intimately these stores of knowledge were linked to romance, empire, and power. Pergamon's legacy endures in every bound book, even though the library is no longer there. Empires were outlived by its parchment. Even if its scrolls are gone, its inventions literally changed the course of history. Ancient China was creating its own literary empire, one based on history, bureaucracy, and an unswerving reverence for the written word, rather than myth or firelight, while the Mediterranean world was trading scrolls and refining paper. During the Han period, 206 BCE, 200 CE, libraries served as more than merely repositories of information. They served as tools for identity, governance, and law and order. The Han emperors had a crucial realization. The narrative is under the power of whoever owns the records. In order to gather, duplicate, and standardize texts, they established an imperial endeavor. Classics preservation was not the only goal here. It has to do with forming culture. The core works of Confucianism, such as the Analects, Book of Rites, and Book of Documents, were carefully selected and preserved in imperial libraries, and the philosophy had evolved into the official state ideology. The imperial library in the Han capital of Chang'an was the most famous of these. It was closed to roving academics in contrast to the Alexandrian library. Court historians, academics, and scribes were in charge of this state archive. census records, astronomical observations, maps, legal codes, genealogy, and literary works were all housed within its walls. The weight of empire supported each inkstroke on silk scrolls or bamboo strips. This approach produced one of the most significant librarians in history. The Han scholar Liu Xiang was assigned to organize the royal collection. He did more than catalogue books. He marked and revised them, frequently choosing which text versions would be kept. Liu Xin, his son, carried on the task and created one of the first classification schemes, classifying literature into 6 main categories: philosophy, poetry, warfare, medicine, divination, and classics. These endeavors weren't risk-free. Thousands of old works were destroyed during the notorious book-burning and scholar-burying that occurred under the previous Qin dynasty. The Han were aware of the risks. Their libraries represented a healing act, a cultural comeback from the grave. However, the format proved brittle. Early writing was done on string-tied bamboo slips that were susceptible to mold, fire, and deterioration over time. Others were expensive and delicate, etched onto silk. Nevertheless, a significant amount of China's classical legacy was preserved because of the Han. Compared to Alexandria, the imperial libraries were not as mythologized. In actuality, though, they might have saved much more. The pen wasn't merely a rival to the sword in China, it was archived. Libraries expanded throughout Asia along with Buddhism. Temples evolved into more than just places to pray. They developed as repositories of ideas, scholarly retreats, and strongholds of brittle wisdom. The Buddhist world created repositories in Tibet, China, India, and Japan that regarded books as holy things rather than as instruments. The custom started in India when monks committed the early Buddhist texts, known as sutras, to memory. However, the requirement to document it grew along with the canon. Manuscripts on palm leaves were wrapped in silk or fabric, knotted with string, and inked. These manuscripts were kept in monasteries that served as more than just places of worship. They served as learning havens in the ancient world. Thousands of monks studied and copied writings on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and language at the vast monastic university of Nalanda, which was established in the 5th century CE. There were reportedly hundreds of thousands of books in Nalanda's library. Tradition holds that it was separated into 3 structures, each of which housed more rare and revered pieces: Ratnasagara, Ocean of Jewels; Ratnadadi, Sea of Jewels; and Ratnaranjaka, Delight of Jewels. When invading soldiers destroyed Nalanda's library in the 12th century, it burnt for months. Not just paper was consumed by the flames, they ate up generations of ideas, arguments, and spiritual wisdom. Buddhist libraries in Tibet, meanwhile, assumed an even more magical function. Texts were frequently preserved in hand-copied manuscripts or carved onto wooden printing blocks. Tengyur, or commentary, and Kangyur, or the Buddha's utterances, were stacked horizontally on shelves, set into the monastery walls and draped in cloth, filling entire rooms. All the manuscripts were relics. It was an act of dedication to replicate one. Local innovations were adopted by Buddhist libraries in China and Japan. The widespread manufacture of sutras was made possible by China's innovation of woodblock printing, and thousands of scrolls were eventually stored at Japan's Ishiyama-dera temple. Because they thought the writings will resurface in a more enlightened period, monks frequently buried sacred scriptures in stone receptacles or sutra mounds to shield them from destruction or battle. Libraries were more than just locations in the Buddhist world. They were deeds of kindness. The Dharma was preserved when a text was preserved. Altars were shelves. Prayer was ink. Even though these hallowed libraries were silent, one document at a time, their impact spread peace, reason, and knowledge across countries. We frequently picture scrolls and parchment, temples and marble when we think of ancient libraries. However, civilizations were constructing their own knowledge stores in the Americas across the oceans. These were exquisite, delicate, and mostly destroyed before they could be investigated. We lost much than just text in the Maya, Aztec, and Inca libraries. It's a whole perspective. One of the most literate pre-Columbian societies was the Maya. They created a sophisticated glyphic writing system that used syllables and logograms to document cosmology, history, astronomy, and ceremonies. They used bark paper that had been coated in white lime and folded like a screen to create their books, or codices. These codices, which were kept in royal libraries and temple vaults, were richly colored, precise, and symbolic. The Maya probably had hundreds or even thousands of codices at their height. However, the majority were destroyed by missionaries after being deemed heretical when the Spanish arrived. Bishop Diego de Landa's order to destroy large volumes of Maya texts in 1562 is the most notorious occurrence. Only 4 Maya codices remain now, he wrote later. Large collections of amoxtin, books written on deerskin, agave fibers, or bark paper, were also preserved by the Aztecs. These comprised tales, history, calendars, and tribute documents. Tlaquilos, or scribes, created living records that were a combination of administrative and religious by painting complex glyphs and symbols using natural paints. These libraries were frequently found in temple complexes and royal palaces. Despite not having a formal writing system, the Inca Empire maintained knowledge by recording numerical and potentially narrative information on quipu, which are knotted strings. These bundles, which were kept in state archives and used to oversee the enormous empire's military supplies, taxes, and census, were read by quipucamayos, or trained officials. However, ruthless cultural elimination followed the advent of European invasion. Within a generation, entire intellectual traditions were suppressed, libraries were set on fire, and quipu were either destroyed or buried. There were waves of colonial policy and missionary zeal that wiped out centuries of learning, but unlike Alexandria or Nineveh, there were no huge fires to point to. The quiet they left behind still reverberates more loudly than words, and the libraries of the Americas were purposefully forgotten rather than simply disappearing. Ancient libraries are a melancholy record of loss as much as a story of preservation. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal only survived because they were inadvertently cooked solid by fire. The Alexandrian scrolls disappeared in the smoke. Fearful hands burned the Maya codices. Under invasion, the Buddhist texts of Nalanda fell to ash. What was previously thought to be everlasting was repeatedly erased by time, conquest, and neglect. Over 90% of ancient literature is thought to have been lost. Entire genres have vanished. Ancient Greek comedies, Roman technical instructions, Indian medical texts, and American historical documents. For thousands of works, we know the names but not the words. We may still sense the emptiness left by their absence. However, why did so much disappear? Material is part of the answer. Parchment burns, bamboo molds, papyrus deteriorates, and clay splits. Before printing, books were fragile, frequently one of a kind, and susceptible to even little humidity. Centuries of accumulated wisdom could be destroyed by a single leaky roof. War was worse. The invaders destroyed identities in addition to burning libraries. In the past, it was just as strategic to destroy a people's books as it was to eliminate their troops. The answer's other component is political. Power is selective, and knowledge is power. Libraries changed along with governments. Old doctrines were eradicated by the new authorities. Entire schools of thought were lost. Rival authors were eliminated, and heretical manuscripts were destroyed because they did not align with the dominant narrative. Still, pieces are left. A Buddhist monk's copy of a manuscript that survived the original's burning, burned scrolls unrolled by contemporary technology, echoes of lost works mentioned in surviving ones, clay shards recovered from ruins, and a Roman historian mentioning a lost Greek poet. No missionary ever discovered the Maya glyph that was scraped into a temple wall. We are connected to the old mind through these fragments. They serve as a reminder that while knowledge is never completely lost, it is never completely safe. Ideas move, but libraries may burn. They endure through adaptation, memory, and translation. Our endeavor to overcome that lengthy history of loss is reflected in the digital archives, satellite backups, and international databases of today. The lesson is still applicable, though. Preservation is a responsibility, not a one-time event. And each time we read a book, whether it's old or new, we're contributing to the preservation of memory that was on the verge of dying. Located in the center of the South Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the closest continental shore, is Rapa Nui, also known to the outside world as Easter Island. The island, which is only roughly 63 square miles in size, is remote, windswept, and eerily silent, but it is home to the Moai sculptures, one of the greatest mysteries of ancient engineering. Nearly 1,000 of these tall stone figures with long noses, heavy brows, and pursed lips can be found standing or lying down all across the island. As if guarding the land, the majority face inland with their backs to the sea. Many have their entire corpses concealed behind centuries' worth of soil, partially buried in the ground. Others are partially cut and abandoned in the middle of creation, lying in quarries. Their entire existence evokes amazement, curiosity, and 1,000 unsolved questions. For what reason were they constructed? They were carved by whom? How did they get moved? And why did those who made them finally give up? For millennia, storytellers, archaeologists, and explorers have been plagued by these puzzles. Easter Island appeared to outsiders as a puzzle encased in volcanic rock. However, the island is completely known to the Rapa Nui people, its home. The Moai are not remnants of a vanished society. Their ancestors are these. Although Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen wrote the first recorded records of the island in 1722, Polynesian explorers who followed the skies and waves discovered this isolated paradise centuries earlier. They gave it the name Rapa Nui, or Great Rapa, and established a society based on a strong sense of clan identification, spiritual tradition, and a revered bond between the living and the dead. The Moai were sculpted as living manifestations of ancestral mana, or spiritual force, rather than as idols to be worshipped. Each one stood guard over their descendants, representing a deified chief or significant ancestor. The statues were more than works of art. They served as protectors and go-betweens for the land and the heavens. However, time is unrelenting, much like the sea. The island's culture had evolved by the time European ships could be seen approaching. The forests were gone, the sculptures were overturned, and all that was left was a faint echo of what had once been a towering structure. Rapa Nui's significance was buried beneath centuries of silence, leaving it as a permanent question mark. The region was unspoiled, lush, forested, and quiet, long before the Moai stood watch over the island's hills. The only sound coming from the volcanic slopes was the shriek of seagulls. Then a fleet of Polynesian canoes arrived, possibly between 800 and 1200 CE. Using only the stars, sea swells, and bird flight patterns, these explorers, who were masters of the water, had traveled thousands of miles. Along with humans, they brought taro, sweet potatoes, pigs, chickens, and bananas from the Marquesas or Mangareva. All that was required to create a new world. To touch the Earth's edge was to land on Rapa Nui. Despite being one of the world's most isolated islands, these people left behind a fully developed society, complex social systems, oral history, strong religious convictions, and a legacy of monumental stonework. The island was eventually split up into clans, each of which was in charge of a distinct region and was centered on a revered ancestor figure, a concept that would soon be etched in stone. The Rapa Nui people prospered in the beginning. They constructed communities, kept poultry in stone enclosures, and grew vegetables in rock gardens to retain moisture, according to archaeological findings. Ariki, chiefs with both political and spiritual power, dominated their highly structured society. Worshipping the ancestors who were thought to have an impact on everything from weather to crops was central to island life. The Moai's carving, the most famous manifestation of this ancestral veneration, would come about in due time. Rapa Nui was not a lost or primitive culture, and this must be understood. It was extremely complex, built on a strong sense of continuity between the living and the dead, and adapted to its hard environment. The decision to start carving giants was influenced by the settlers' spiritual worldview, which they carried with them in addition to equipment. However, the island was in equilibrium for the time being in these early ages. The first Moai was still generations away, but the groundwork had been established both culturally and spiritually for what would turn out to be one of the most remarkable sculpture legacies on the planet. The land was still covered in forests, the sea offered fish, and the soil was fertile. The tale was far from over. Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater with steep slopes and soft carvable stone, is at the center of Rapa Nui's holy geography. Most of the island's Moai originated here, thanks to meticulous craftsmanship rather than myth or mythology. Volcanic tuff, a compacted ash stone that was comparatively soft and perfect for carving, at least in its early phases, was the rock that was used. The statues would eventually harden into their recognizable weathered appearance from exposure to the environment. Rano Raraku was more than just a quarry. It was a place of pilgrimage, sweat, and holy work, as well as a spiritual workshop. The Rapa Nui artists sculpted hundreds of Moai from its slopes and cliff faces. Some are still partially constructed, while others are finished but never moved. Nearly 400 statues still stand at the location today, frozen in mid-process, as if the workman had just disappeared. A Moai's carving was no easy task. A clan commissioned each statue to honor a particular ancestor, typically a strong leader. With an elongated face, heavy brow, large ears, and a prominent nose, the designs adhered to a symbolic formula. With fingers carved in delicate, stylized relief and arms squeezed against the torso, the flesh was frequently hardly visible. From small 6-footers to the enormous El Gigante, an incomplete statue more than 70 feet tall and weighing an estimated 150 tons, the Moai varied in size. The chisels and axes that the carvers employed were fashioned of hard basalt, a much harder volcanic rock. It required teams of artisans who passed down their knowledge through generations, and the process took months or even years. The Moai stayed attached to the rock wall while they worked. They wouldn't be separated, slid downhill, and ready for transportation until they were almost finished. The sheer quantity of statues still buried in the ground is what gives Rano Raraku its eerie atmosphere today. Despite the fact that many of them seem partially buried, they are full-bodied people whose bottom parts have been engulfed by soil due to decades of erosion. In reality, the Moai have been standing calmly, neck-deep in time, yet it gives the unsettling appearance that they are sinking. The island's giants were conceived in this crater where stone and spirit converged, and volcanic ash was molded by human hands into everlasting forebears. Where the Moai gaze rather than how they were carved is one of their most fascinating qualities. On Rapa Nui, almost all of the Moai statues face inland, away from the sea. This was no coincidence. The purpose of the Moai was to observe the people, not the waves. Ahu, a ceremonial site that functioned as a foundation and frequently a place of burial for the person the Moai represented, was where each statue stood, anchoring each clan's domain and pointing toward the center of their communities. These ahu were scattered throughout the island's beaches like spiritual outposts. The moai essentially served as protectors, representing strong ancestors who provided spiritual protection and kept watch over the settlements. The moai were more than just sculptures to the Rapa Nui people. Mana, a sacred energy said to live in gods, leaders, and respected dead, was contained in them as living beings. A moai was believed to transfer mana into the soil after it was built, guaranteeing fertility, bountiful harvests, and clan well-being. They served as intermediaries between the spiritual and material realms and were more than only memorials. They were engaged members of society. In order to convey both idealized ancestry and supernatural authority, the moai's features were purposefully exaggerated. The long noses, high cheekbones, and deep-set eyes served as visual symbols for strength, knowledge, and divine ancestry. The statue's austere features suggested a serene, ever-present alertness, while the long ears might have represented the upper class. Large red stone top-knots known as pukau, which were extracted from Punapau, another volcanic location, were also used to atop several moai. These cylinder-shaped additions might have served as ceremonial headdresses or hairstyles, further signifying respect and status. The statue's eyes were originally inlaid with coral and had pupils made of red scoria or obsidian, which gave them a much more dramatic and lifelike appearance than the empty eye sockets we see now. The moai were thought to see for the first time when the eyes were installed during ceremonies, changing from stone to sacred. The core of Rapa Nui spirituality can be seen by looking at the moai from the interior. These statues were never intended for public seeing. Immovable, unblinking, and timeless, they were constructed for the people, facing their descendants, and solemnly observing the arrival and departure of generation after generation. Without wheels, cranes, or mechanical tools, how can a 30-foot, 80-ton stone monument be moved over miles of rugged terrain? This was Rapa Nui's big riddle for centuries. The moai on the island are dispersed over great areas. Many are situated on stone ahu platforms that are distant from the Rano Raraku quarry. Early suggestions suggested rolling them on logs or pulling them on wooden sledges, which begged even more concerns in light of the island's extreme deforestation. Others, more fantastical, proposed spiritually induced levitation or alien interference, although the island's own oral history might hold the real solution. The Rapa Nui folklore states that the moai travelled by foot. Although this seems like a fantasy at first, researchers have successfully taken this theory literally in recent years. Using ropes and groups of people placed on either side of a model moai, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo carried out an amazing experiment in 2012. Like shimmying a big refrigerator, they were able to rock the statue forward in a controlled, upright manner. Coordination, rhythm, and balance were crucial. This would have allowed the moai to be carried upright, as the stories said. Just human creativity and tradition. No dragging, no logs, no science fiction. This notion is also supported by the bases of numerous moai. Their rounded front, flat back, and curved bottoms imply that they were made to tilt and pivot forward rather than lie down. Large teams, plant fiber ropes, and most importantly, trust, would have been needed for this mode of transportation. Mana, the ancestors' sacred energy, was considered to have the ability to move the moai in Rapa Nui mysticism. It was thought that this spiritual energy, which could bring the statues to life during ceremonies, was under the control of chiefs and priests. The Rapa Nui therefore witnessed the divine at action, whilst engineers perceive physics. Actually, both were correct. Moai transportation was more than just an engineering issue. It was a public demonstration of solidarity, dedication, and ancestry. The moai moved because people were compelled to, not because they used magic. According to that theory, human cooperation motivated by spiritual purpose, rather than stone, was Rapa Nui's greatest architectural feat. The construction of moai didn't slow down over the ages, rather it surged. As each tribe attempted to honor its ancestors with grander, more intimidating statues, the early concord among Rapa Nui's clans gave way to growing rivalry. Over time, what started out as spiritual homage transformed into a competitive custom of tremendous pride. Clans fought for supremacy through stone artistry rather than combat. A larger moai represented a stronger claim to ancestral authority, more status, and more mana. By building larger sculptures, new features, and more intricate ceremonial platforms, each clan aimed to surpass the others. The contest was about spiritual superiority, not simply size. Important innovations resulted from this competition. Both height and symbolic weight were increased with the introduction of pukao, which are massive red stone top knots fashioned from the volcanic stone at Punapau. Some weighing as much as 12 tons, these top knots would have served as sacred headdresses or hairstyles worn by powerful chiefs, serving as tangible symbols of heavenly favor. Moai design changed as well. Early sculptures were comparatively wide and short, but they gradually became more angular, thinner, and remarkably taller. Like ancient giants, some of the later moai towered over settlements, reaching heights of over 30 feet. However, there was a price for this escalation. The island's trees were cleared to make way for the expanding building projects. The wood may have been utilized for fuel, food production, canoe construction, and, according to more ancient hypotheses, transportation. The loss of tree cover exacerbated soil erosion, reduced agricultural productivity, and made it more difficult to control freshwater resources. The moai people continued to live despite the gradual depletion of the fundamental resources that underpinned their society. More, bigger statues were carved instead. With the hope that the ancestors would bring equilibrium back, they delved deeper into spiritual traditions. But now the equilibrium was shifting. Clan conflicts started to simmer as the island's environment declined. Competition gave way to animosity. The spirit of cooperation that had once inspired giants was crumbling beneath the weight of survival. The heyday of moai construction was now a burden. But it was unimaginable to stop construction. The moai were the beating heart of Rapa Nui's identity, not just a set of symbols. Thus, despite the thinning earth beneath them, the islanders persisted in crafting devotion from stone. There was a spiritual arms race going on that nobody could afford to lose. By the 17th century, the unimaginable had occurred. Rapa Nui was falling apart. Ancestor worship through the building of moai, the very system that had once brought the island together, had depleted its resources. The woods have vanished. Without trees, there would be no fuel for cooking or building, no canoes for deep-sea fishing, and no protection from the island's intense winds and sun. Once shielded by roots and shade, the fertile volcanic soil had deteriorated. The crops wilted. There was a shortage of fresh water. Nevertheless, the sculptures continued to appear despite the difficulty of survival. Bigger, more intricate, more labor-intensive. The island's spiritual engine ran continuously. However, the populace quickly took a radical action. The construction of the moai ceased. Some statues were dropped off in the middle of transit, laying like forgotten giants along historic highways. Others had their chisels frozen in time at the quarry, half-finished. The limit has been reached in the spiritual arms race. What the land could no longer support, the forefathers could no longer supply. The topplings followed. Moai all throughout the island were purposefully pushed over, starting in the late 1600s, according to archaeological data. They snapped their necks, they broke their faces. Nature wasn't responsible for this. It was a human struggle. Clans started battling for pride, territory, and water. The very statues that previously stood for solidarity were the objects of retaliation and anger. According to oral tales, this was the period of statue toppling, and the development of the Huri Moai, power moved in the direction of a new spiritual political order when belief in the Moai system crumbled. The Birdman religion prioritized ceremonial violence, agility, and competition over ancestral mana. With this cultural revolution, an era came to an end. The island society discovered by the first European explorers in 1722 was very dissimilar from the one that had carved the Moai. There was not a single monument on its podium. The people were fighting to survive in a split and deforested region, and the once vibrant spiritual structure had been disrupted. Rapa Nui's demise was not the result of a single incident. The slow-motion collapse was brought on by social competitiveness, environmental fatigue, and a spiritual system that was unable to adjust fast enough. All that was left were fallen gods in stone, gazing up at the sky as though to inquire how it had all gone wrong. The civilization had already collapsed when Dutch adventurer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722. The Moai was overturned. The woods have vanished. The Rapa Nui people were few, lean, cautious, and had endured many generations of adversity. Although Roggeveen's men observed the statues and the desolate surroundings, they were unable to comprehend the civilization that produced them. Then the outsiders continued to arrive. Over the course of the following 200 years, Rapa Nui was devastated by European contact. Arriving whalers, preachers, traders, and slave traders all left their imprint, with the majority of them wiping off more than they wrote. Nearly 500 Rapa Nui people, including the high leaders and scribes, were abducted by Peruvian slave pirates in 1862. Few of them ever came back. Smallpox accompanied them, and among the survivors it spread like wildfire. The arrival of Christian missionaries, who aimed to bring civilization to the islanders, was far worse. They outlawed customs, demolished holy sculptures, and compelled conversions, frequently substituting imported European customs for the Moai-centered spiritual life. The written language, Rongorongo, which may be the sole native script in Oceania, was virtually extinct, and the oral traditions that had maintained the island's history for generations were suppressed. The island's population had dropped just over 100 by the late 1800s. In order to fence off ancestral places and confine the Rapa Nui people to a limited area of the island, colonial forces divided up Rapa Nui's territory and leased it as sheep pasture. There were restrictions even on their access to the Moai. Once living representations of authority and family, the sculptures were abandoned, robbed, or treated as curious objects by foreign explorers and collectors, turning into quiet memorials. Statues, ritual objects, and even human remains were taken out by European archaeologists and sent to museums in Paris, London, and Santiago. Thousands of miles from their hallowed homes, some Moai have been severed at the base and removed in their entirety. The Rapa Nui people never lost sight of their identity, even though the island had turned into a case study in cultural erasure. They carried the Moai's memory even amid imposed quiet. The customs persisted, unseen, murmured, and transmitted in bits and pieces, and gradually, over the ages, the people would start to recover the inscribed tales. The world had to learn to listen first, though. Rapa Nui started a gradual but resolute process of cultural reclamation and restoration in the 20th and 21st centuries. After being overturned and buried by time, war, and neglect, the Moai were progressively resurrected as symbols of resiliency as well as historical monuments. Easter Island gained international recognition in the 1950s thanks to renowned Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl. Even if a lot of his assumptions were wrong, particularly the ones he made concerning South American impact, his work sparked curiosity about archaeology and around the world. International researchers flocked to the island to study and repair rather than to steal as before. The restoration process started in earnest. They rebuilt fallen Moai on their Ahu platforms. the eyes of coral were rebuilt. Top knots from Pukao were given back. Maps and research were done on the island's historic routes, quarries, and ceremonial locations. A more distinct image of the Rapa Nui civilization, one of technical mastery, profound spirituality, and intricate culture, began to take shape. However, foreign scholars' voices were no longer the most significant. They were the actual Rapa Nui people. The language, customs, and land rights of the original builders' descendants started to be reclaimed. The majority of the island's archaeological sites are located in Rapa Nui National Park, which Chile formally returned to the Rapa Nui community in 2017. Locals currently manage the moai and its upkeep, and choices about excavation and preservation are based on their hereditary knowledge and cultural sensitivity. In addition to textbooks, elders, chants, dances, and the moai themselves are teaching the next generation about their ancestors' stories. With cautious optimism, efforts are still on to decode the island's strange writing, Rongorongo. Additionally, there is growing demand on international organizations like the Louvre and the British Museum to restore religious objects and moai that were seized during the colonial era. Rapa Nui is currently at a juncture where modernism and remembrance meet. Waves of tourists arrive, and economic growth presents both opportunities and risks. However, the people still preserve their heritage as a living custom rather than a frozen artifact. The moai are no longer the silent protectors of a vanished world. They now serve as a testament to survival, to a civilization that managed to rise above colonization, erasure, and collapse. The ancestors remain despite the voices being muffled, the trees burning, and the stone cracking.